The rain hit the gopher wood like a barrage of iron shot. It was a rhythmic, deafening roar that vibrated through the very marrow of the timber frame. Every plank groaned under the weight of the deluge, a sound that signaled the absolute end of an era. Outside, the world had ceased to be a place of land and sky. It was now a churning liquid abyss that sought to reclaim everything. The impact was constant, a relentless hammering that drowned out thought and shattered the silence of the horizon. Inside the vessel, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp resin and the metallic tang of ozone. The structure shuddered as a massive wave slammed against the starboard side. It was not merely a storm. It was a cleansing fire of water, a finality that left no room for hope or hesitation. The roar outside was total, an all-consuming wall of sound that isolated the Ark from the dying world. Noah stood in the center of the hold. He watched the walls pulse with the strain of the pressure. The chaos outside was absolute. He did not look at the windows. He looked at the floor, waiting for the ship to hold. Noah turned his back on the groaning hull. He did not check the stalls for lions or elephants. Those were merely the surface of his charge. He moved to the center of the hold, where a series of heavy, lead-lined jars sat bolted to the deck. The ship pitched violently, but he ignored the tilt. His focus narrowed to the containers. He knelt on the damp floor. His hands calloused and steady despite the vessel's erratic motion. He reached out, tracing the etched symbols on the lids. They were not mere containers. They were the genetic blueprints of a world being erased. As his fingertips brushed the metal, the symbols flared with a soft, rhythmic pulse. The light cast long, shifting shadows against the timber walls. He checked the seals, feeling the cold weight of the lead against his palms. Each jar held the potential for a new beginning. He tightened a final locking bolt, ensuring the integrity of the templates. The world outside was dying, but the future was secure in his hands. Noah rose from the deck, his joints stiff from the long hours of labor. He stepped away from the storage units and felt the floor shift beneath him. The ship was alive. It did not merely ride the waves. It cut through them with a precision that defied the fury of the storm. A low-frequency vibration hummed through the soles of his boots, a steady, rhythmic thrum that seemed to bleed out of the very timber of the hull. It was a sound of immense power, a deep, resonant bass that sat beneath the chaotic roar of the rain. Outside, the world was being torn apart, but here, the air felt different. It was crisp, filtered, and strangely still. The vibration acted as a barrier, a physical wall of sound. Noah placed a hand against the wall and felt the energy coursing through the grain of the wood. It was not just a vessel of wood and pitch. The chaos outside was a deafening, mindless force. But inside, the Ark maintained a perfect, calculated equilibrium. He walked toward the center. While the world outside dissolved into liquid chaos, the Ark remained a bastion of order, a high-tech fortress holding the line against the end of all things. Noah moved toward the central bulkhead, his gaze shifting from the floor to the wall. Mounted there, encased in a framework of polished brass and strange, dark glass, sat the relic of Enoch. It was a complex, pulsating device that seemed to breathe in time with the ship. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the surface, feeling the intense heat radiating from the core. This was the heart of the Ark, the engine of its survival. The device emitted a steady, rhythmic glow, casting amber light across the surrounding timber. It was designed for a singular, desperate purpose: to stabilize the internal environment against the lethal atmospheric radiation bleeding from the collapsing world. Outside, the air was toxic, a swirling vortex of energy that would dissolve anything it touched. Here, the relic created a localized field, a bubble of safety that kept the radiation at bay. Noah watched the internal mechanisms shift, small gears and crystalline rods moving with fluid, silent precision. Every pulse of the light was a calculation. The steady amber light of the relic suddenly fractured. A sharp, discordant whine pierced the low-frequency hum of the hold, and the device shuddered within its brass casing. Outside, the atmospheric pressure surged, a violent wave of raw, unseen energy slamming against the Ark's hull. The relic flared, its internal crystalline rods spinning into a blur as it fought to compensate for the sudden spike in radiation. Noah gripped the bulkhead, his knuckles white, as the entire vessel groaned under the strain. The light from the machine began to strobe, casting jagged, erratic shadows that danced across the timber walls. It was a desperate, mechanical dance. Noah watched the energy levels drop, then spike, then drop again. The machine was overheating, the brass frame radiating a heat that singed the air. He reached for the manual override, his fingers hovering over the glowing controls, waiting for the exact moment to force the system back into alignment. The world outside was not just water, it was an erasure, and the machine was the only thing standing between existence and total silence. Noah stepped back from the bulkhead, his boots heavy on the timber floor. He turned toward the center of the hold, where the air felt denser, charged with a different kind of static. Resting on a raised dais of dark, polished stone sat the golden sarcophagus. Above it, the Tsohar stone hung suspended in a cradle of iron, casting a steady, amber light that seemed to pulse in synchronization with the ship's heartbeat. As Noah approached, the stone flared, its radiance sharpening the intricate, geometric carvings etched into the gold surface of the casing. These were not mere decorations. They were maps of a lineage that predated the flood. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the cold metallic lid. The sarcophagus held the remains of Adam, a spiritual anchor meant to preserve the divine spark that had been fading from the world for generations. The amber light washed over the gold, revealing faint, swirling patterns that shifted whenever the ark groaned under the pressure of the deep. Noah felt the gravity of the object, a weight that had nothing to do with mass and everything to do with legacy. This was the core of the mission, the reason the ark had been built. Noah pressed his palms against the cold, unyielding gold of the sarcophagus. The metal hummed, a low vibration that traveled up his arms and settled deep in his chest. Beneath his fingertips, he traced the etched symbols, feeling the faint, residual warmth of the divine spark trapped within. It was a fragile, flickering presence, a stark contrast to the crushing weight of the ocean pressing against the hull. Outside, the rhythmic thudding of the Nephilim grew louder, a desperate, chaotic pounding that threatened to breach the timber walls. Noah felt the vibration of their rage through the floorboards, a dark, discordant frequency that sought to extinguish the amber glow of the Tsohar stone. He pushed harder against the casing, his muscles straining as he anchored himself to the dais. The air in the hold grew thin, heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. He did not look toward the door. He kept his focus on the seams of the sarcophagus, ensuring the seal remained unbroken. Every strike from the outside sent a tremor through the room, but the golden casing held firm. It was a silent, immovable anchor in a world dissolving into chaos. Noah realized then that he was not merely guarding a relic. He was holding the line. Noah pulled his hands from the sarcophagus, his fingers trembling from the residual cold of the metal. He turned away from the amber light, his gaze drifting toward the reinforced timbers of the hull. He had seen them before the waters rose the offspring of the Watchers. Their eyes were not human. They were mirrors of a fractured reality, swirling with a hunger that defied nature. He remembered the way they moved, a predatory grace that betrayed the corruption woven into their very blood. They were not merely seeking shelter from the flood. They were hunting the essence of what humanity had been before the fall. Every time he recalled their faces, he felt a sharp, stinging clarity. This was not a war of territory or survival, but a biological and spiritual siege. He stood motionless, listening to the muffled, rhythmic pounding outside, and understood the true scale of his burden. The hold was a tomb of silence. Noah moved toward the navigation console, his fingers tracing the cold, etched lines of the celestial charts. He needed to adjust the drift, to keep the ark aligned with the shifting currents of the deep. He leaned in, his breath hitching as he calculated the trajectory. Then, the world tilted. A violent, bone-jarring thud slammed into the hull, echoing through the timber like a thunderclap in a canyon. The force of it knocked Noah sideways, his shoulder slamming into the bulkhead. Dust rained from the ceiling, swirling in the amber light of the Zohar stone. The ship groaned, a long, metallic screech of wood and iron straining against an impossible weight. Noah scrambled to regain his footing, his hands gripping the edge of the console until his knuckles turned white. The silence was gone, replaced by the chaotic, rhythmic pounding of something massive against the outer walls. He froze, his ears straining against the roar of the rain outside. This was not the sea. This was not the wind. Something had found them in the dark. The ark was no longer a sanctuary drifting in the void. It was a target. He looked toward the heavy timber doors, his pulse hammering against his throat. Noah lunged toward the bulkhead, his boots sliding on the vibrating deck. The wood groaned, a deep, agonized sound that signaled the structural integrity was failing under the assault. He reached the heavy iron lever, his fingers locking around the cold, rusted metal. Outside the narrow observation slit, the rain was no longer the only movement. Massive, distorted shadows flickered against the timber, pressing their weight against the hull with a rhythmic, predatory persistence. Noah did not hesitate. He threw his entire weight against the lever. The iron teeth of the lock ground together, a harsh, metallic screech that cut through the roar of the storm. With a final, desperate heave, the lever dropped into place. The heavy bolt slid home, securing the chamber with a dull, final thud that vibrated through his very bones. He leaned his forehead against the cold surface of the door. The room went still, the amber light of the Tsohar stone casting long, distorted shapes across the floor. He was inside. They were outside. The lock held, but the ship shivered under a new kind of violence. Outside, the Nephilim were not merely pushing, they were probing. Noah pressed his ear to the timber, hearing the scrape of massive, calloused fingers searching for a seam in the wood. These were not desperate survivors seeking a dry deck. They were hunters. He watched through the observation slit as a colossal shadow blocked out the storm, its movements deliberate and precise. They were looking for the plates of Adam. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The knowledge of the ancients, the genetic blueprints of the world, was the prize they sought to claim. A rhythmic thudding began, a calculated assault against the hull that vibrated through the floorboards. Each strike was placed with intent, targeting the structural weak points, where the internal bracing met the outer frame. The wood groaned in protest, splintering under the concentrated pressure. Noah backed away, his hand hovering near the Tsohar stone. He saw the wall bow inward, the heavy beams groaning as if they might snap like dry twigs. The hull gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. A massive, gray-skinned hand punched through the heavy timber, splinters flying like shrapnel across the deck. Noah stumbled back, his boots crunching on the debris. The hand was enormous, its fingers thick and calloused, clawing at the air with a primal, desperate hunger. It reached for the central pedestal, its grip closing around the edge of the navigation console. Noah braced himself, but before the intruder could pull itself inside, the air in the room shifted. A low, harmonic hum rose to a piercing frequency. Suddenly, the geometric key embedded in the bulkhead flared to life. A shimmering, golden energy field erupted from the wood, a wall of pure, crackling light that filled the breach. The Nephilim's hand struck the barrier and recoiled instantly, the skin sizzling as if touched by molten iron. A guttural roar echoed from outside, muffled by the storm but vibrating with raw, unbridled fury. The golden light pulsed, expanding outward to seal the jagged tear in the hull, knitting the timber back together with a searing, rhythmic glow. The intruder was thrown back into the churning darkness of the flood. Silence returned to the chamber, save for the hum of the shield, which remained locked in place. The golden light of the shield flickered, struggling to compensate for the immense weight pressing against the outer hull. Outside, the water was no longer just a flood. It was a crushing, rhythmic force. The Nephilim had changed their tactics. They were no longer clawing at the seams. They were throwing their entire mass against the side of the vessel, attempting to roll the ark into the abyss. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic scream of timber and iron under impossible tension. Noah felt the floor tilt beneath his boots, the angle steepening until he was forced to drop to his knees to maintain balance. Every joint in the ark shrieked. He scrambled toward the central bulkhead, his hands gripping the cold, vibrating metal of the support beams. The pressure was absolute. He could hear the wood fibers snapping, a slow, agonizing sound that signaled the limits of his construction. He braced his shoulder against the primary strut, his muscles burning as he fought to hold the frame together. The vessel shuddered, dipping further into the churning black water. Noah shoved off the bulkhead, his legs shaking from the sustained strain. He lunged across the tilting floor, boots sliding on the damp wood, and reached the navigation console. It was a chaotic array of shifting light and rotating brass rings. He slammed his palms against the primary interface, but the display remained dark, flickering with static. Outside, the roar of the water intensified, a deafening reminder that the Ark was drifting toward the vortex. He grabbed the central lever, pulling it down to engage the manual override. The console groaned, resisting his weight. He gritted his teeth, locking his elbows, and forced the mechanism into position. The celestial charts flared to life, projecting a map of the stars onto the ceiling. He traced the glowing constellations with his fingers, his movements sharp and precise. He needed to align the vessel with the currents, not fight them. The ship shuddered, then leveled out. The violent tilting ceased, replaced by a steady, forward momentum. He watched the charts stabilize. The roar of the storm faded to a distant, muffled vibration. Noah pulled his hands from the console, the tips of his fingers stinging from the heat of the interface. He turned toward the center of the hold. The amber light of the Tsohar stone pulsed, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the floor. He walked to the golden sarcophagus, his boots heavy against the timber. He placed a palm on the lid, feeling the faint, static hum of the remains within. These were not just relics. They were the final remnants of a civilization that had already ceased to exist. He moved to the lead-lined jars, tracing the etched symbols one by one. Each seal was a promise. Each container held a blueprint for a world that had been systematically erased by the rising tides. The silence of the ship was heavier than the chaos of the storm. He understood then that the Ark was not merely a vessel for survival. It was a laboratory, a bunker, and a bridge. He was the only thing standing between the total extinction of human history and the fragile possibility of a new beginning. He stood in the center of the room, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the dark, sealed bulkhead. He was the gatekeeper. The grinding sound of timber against stone vibrated through the hull, then stopped. The Ark was no longer drifting. Noah stood in the center of the hold, the silence of the world outside pressing against the walls. He grabbed the heavy iron handle of the main hatch and pulled. It did not move. He braced his boots against the floor, locked his muscles, and heaved. The seal broke with a sharp, metallic crack. He pushed the hatch wide. A rush of cold, stagnant air flooded the room, carrying the scent of wet silt and decay. Noah stepped onto the ramp, his feet sinking into the thick, gray mud of a transformed earth. He turned back, reaching into the hold to retrieve the lead-lined jars. He lifted them, the weight of the genetic blueprints pulling at his arms. He walked into the gray haze, carrying the only remnants of a history that had been scrubbed from the face of the planet. Noah reached the solid ground where his sons waited. They stood in a line, their boots caked in the same gray silt that clung to his own. He set the lead-lined jars down, the metal clinking against a flat stone. He looked at them, expecting the relief of survivors, but found something else. He caught the gaze of the eldest, then the youngest. Their eyes did not scan the horizon for the sun. They tracked the movement of the jars. There was a sharpness in their focus, a calculation that mirrored the cold, analytical hunger he had seen in the creatures that clawed at the Ark. Noah felt the air grow thin. He stepped between them and the artifacts, his hands dropping to his sides. The silence of the earth was no longer peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. He saw the flicker of forbidden knowledge behind their pupils, a shadow of the same ambition that had brought the world to the brink of collapse. The water had retreated, but the rot had not washed away. It had traveled with them, anchored in the minds of those he had sworn to protect. He realized then that the battle had not ended on the waves. It had only moved to the shore. He stood his ground, the weight of the jars behind him, and watched the realization settle. Noah turned his back on them. He did not speak. He knelt in the thick, wet silt and began to dig. His fingers clawed into the earth, pushing aside layers of gray mud and debris. The ground was heavy, resisting his efforts, but he did not stop. He worked with a rhythmic, frantic intensity, his breath hitching in the cold air. He reached for the lead-lined jars, dragging them into the shallow pit he had carved. He did not look up when he heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind him. His sons were moving closer, their shadows stretching long across the mud. He shoved the jars deeper, piling the dark, wet earth over the glowing symbols on the lids. He packed the silt down with his palms, smoothing the surface. He stood up, his knees aching, his hands stained black with the residue of the old world. He faced them, his posture rigid, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The artifacts were gone, hidden beneath the weight of the silent earth. He had buried the fire that had nearly consumed history, but he felt the heat of it still radiating. He stood as a gatekeeper over the grave of his own mission, waiting for the inevitable moment when the earth would be forced to give it back. The Ark sat silent on the mud, a hollow shell of timber and history. Noah walked away, his stride heavy, leaving the burial site behind. He did not look back. Yet, as the wind shifted, the ground beneath his feet pulsed. It was a low, rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of the Watchers still trapped in the sediment of time. The giants were gone, but their influence remained. A dormant seed waiting for the next cycle of human ambition. Noah understood the truth. He had not destroyed the fire. He had only delayed the inevitable. Somewhere in the distant future, a hand would dig into this same silt. A finger would brush against the cold, etched metal of a lid. The secrets would rise again. He reached the edge of the horizon and stopped, watching the sun break through the gray clouds. The world was new, but the shadows were already lengthening, reaching out from the earth to claim the next generation.